Pragmatism seems to be the new buzzword of the moment for shipping. What that means, though, requires a bit of decoding. Those of you who have been schlepping around the conference circuit at Posidonia in Athens this week will have noticed that it comes up quite a lot when talking about decisions that have not been made. A lot has happened in the past few years. We need to factor in energy security as well as energy transition. The technology is there, the regulation is coming, but realistically the fuel supply is not. We need to focus on efficiency this decade. Oh, and by the way, 2050 net zero, that seems pretty unlikely now. We need to be pragmatic. So, is this outbreak of pragmatism a genuine shift towards a more realistic conversation? A resetting after the greenwashed ambitions that never really had any substance? Or are we starting to feel the ESG backlash playing out and pulling back on some of the difficult substance of what lies ahead in terms of the energy transition? Now, I know what you're thinking. He's been down in Athens drinking the Greek tramp sector Kool-Aid. He's gone native. Well, I don't think so. Certainly, I have had some interesting conversations, and yes, it would appear that my wokest green agenda is not universally welcomed by some. But this is not about Posidonia, or the difference in attitude between liner and tramp business models. I'm hearing this push for pragmatism from many of the most progressive voices who previously argued with conviction for ambition when it came to shipping's energy transition and all that entails. But there has been a shift.
I think the 2050 target is an extraordinarily ambitious one. I mean, frankly speaking, unless something is breaking through on the technology side, shipping will struggle tremendously to meet that target.
That's not some dinosaur ship owner pushing back on regulation. That's Ørbeck-Nilssen, the chief executive of DNV Maritime, talking to me in one of the very noisy halls at Posidonia this week. Incidentally, there is going to be a fair bit of background noise to the chats this week. Sorry. But we were talking generally about how the conversations are going with DNV's clients, and inevitably, it pretty quickly turned to the P word.
I think there's a big interest now around pragmatism, and pragmatism is sort of now developing into more specifics around what type of vessels you are trading, the geographies in which you are trading. So one fuel will not sort of suit every need. I think that has been a realization. And then, as we also said in our maritime forecast some time ago, the real hurdle is the availability of the fuels. And we see that the fuel technology transition is happening. There are vessels being ordered with dual fuel capabilities. But of course, many of these vessels, especially those going for dual fuel methanol, will struggle to find the green version of the methanol fuel. So I think we are in a decade where energy efficiency is really what we need to push forward now, because it's still another decade before we will have, significant volumes that will help us on the, say, the ammonia and the methanol side. LNG is around and it gives certain reductions, which is not the perfect solution, but it is tangible. And unfortunately, it's quite costly to put in dual fuel LNG capabilities on vessels, and that is sort of hindering the further uptake of that to a certain degree. So, I think we need now really to focus on the energy efficiency side as we wait for the infrastructure, the supply side, and not least the availability of the fuels.
I appreciate that we are talking about a complex series of interconnected issues here, and don't worry, I am not going to take you down a rabbit hole of regulatory arguments and future fuel debates. This is more about whether we are collectively adjusting our expectations in terms of what can now feasibly happen and by when. Obviously, there was a lot of pushback from many of the big Greek names this week in Posidonia. That's to some extent to be expected, and I'm deliberately not making this about the Greek view this week. We will get to that at some other time. But this is about how the tone is changing, and how the industry is looking carefully at the detail in front of it and trying to work out what it can now reasonably do. Here's Chris Winnicki, President and CEO of ABS, talking about why the conversation is changing.
Yeah, well, I mean, on top of everything else, you have something that I think people were not expecting. You've got you've got this energy security versus energy transition dialogue. Okay, I mean, listen, we have seen. I mean, there's probably about 13 FPSOs that were ordered last year, about another 8 or 9 ordered this year. So, you have got kind of that balance going on top of kind of the journey to 2050. But I think what you're really seeing here is a very practical and pragmatic view, okay? And basically what I'm hearing here is that, this line of sight, with everything that we've seen, we can kind of run very efficient ships. Because you got to remember, if you look at a typical owner and they look at their playbook, okay, 60-70% is the fuel, but they can control the other 30%. Okay, and by the way, new ships are more efficient inherently than vessels. And what you're seeing is, I can run this knowing, and that's without even superimposing the dynamics of the market. I could run this for 10 or 15 years. A lot can happen in 10 or 15 years, to be honest with you, going forward. And I think what you're seeing is the kind of the hard reality and the practical nature of this industry starting to, this is what I think is coming out of here. And then how they respond, because they do have to, because listen, not everything is settled yet, okay? We talk about, global shipping shapers, okay, we talk about technology, we talk about regulations. Regulations nothing's been really kind of gelled together right now, okay? So listen, if you're an owner and you're looking at the world ahead and you're looking at all that uncertainty, and you're asking yourself, what am I going to do? Regulations are completely there. There's a lot of movements, okay, but regulations aren't completely sorted out. Obviously, technology readiness timelines aren't there yet. Even basic agreements between owners and charterers haven't been sorted out. So the real question is why, and on top of all of that, even if you wanted to spend money, you don't have the affordability, availability, or scalability of a fuel to sort out, let alone the infrastructure. So you can go 10, 15 years with conventional fuel, knowing that you can add bio, knowing that you will eventually see onboard carbon capture, knowing that you can stretch this out over time. If you ordered a vessel today with the current CII requirements, conventional fuel, they can actually go 10 years before you make a rating change. An LNG vessel can go 20 years. So there's enough runway there to be able to kind of manage the, short game and long game.
Just before the regulatory regulars reach for their green ink and start writing me some strongly worded letters, I should point out that this pragmatism argument is not necessarily questioning the pace of change in the regulatory timeline. It is, of course, linked in terms of the market-based mechanism and the carbon pricing that itself is needed to catalyse and cover the cost differential on green fuel production. But this is more about what the industry does while it's waiting. Here's Bud Dar, Executive Vice President of Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at MSC Group, to explain it, well, better than I can.
Well, if anything, I'd say now that we've put, the end point stake in the ground, which now matches up with what the industry's been calling for since before COP26 in Glasgow, which is net zero for 2050, I think we're starting to see some signs that it's actually more achievable, not less achievable. The challenges are still significant, and I don't mean to downplay that at all, because we're dealing with that as we examine a variety of molecules in our own multi-fuel solution set that we see. But I do think the signs of commitments on both the ship owner side, the energy provider side are there, and the OEMs for the equipment we're going to need to consume the molecules are winning the race against those that are actually trying to bring the molecules to the marketplace. They're doing a very good job. So I think the pace is really improving as far as being able to meet the aspirations. Will the pace of the regulators be up to the challenge is a whole other thing, because there's a whole political backdrop of which what in an ideal world will be technical regulations are actually created here. And it's vitally important, in my opinion, that the regulations are fit for purpose and they allow enough flexibility to accommodate a range of fuel and energy solutions, energy consumption solutions, as well as to provide the right incentives in the framework and not incentivize the wrong behavior to help us all meet that end state. And I think it's also very important, now that we're talking about absolute emissions in the end, the importance of a metric that looks at just carbon intensity or per unit becomes less and less helpful over time unless you're looking at it in the aggregate for progress, because we saw plenty of examples of that during the pandemic, especially where you actually went the wrong direction on the CII scores. If you applied that formula to the operations then you really want your absolute emissions can be completely in the opposite direction from your CII performance. And I'm not criticizing those that promoted mandate regulation. I'm just saying you have to understand its limitation, and maybe now is the time to really look at how do we get the end state. I really think a fuel standard coupled with economic elements that go with that is really going to be the kind of secret sauce we need to have the breakthrough that's required here.
So the regulatory objectives, well, they're not really in question, are they? Whether or not the industry likes it, we now have a time frame to work towards. What seems to be happening now, and this was very evident in Posidonia this week, is that the owners, and particularly the tramp shipping owners, so dominant in Greece, they're looking realistically at how they achieve those objectives. Here's BV's Executive Vice President of Marine and Offshore, Mathieu de Tougny.
So we are probably back to more practical ways to achieve that objective to me. And in Greece, it's a very specific area, as you said, dealing a lot with tankers, with bulkers, but gas now, as you know, so many players move to gas, important players. But bulkers, tankers, I think half of the fleet is at spot, so tramping, so it's a very specific business compared to liners. That's why they need probably more practical solutions, to achieve, this goal. That's my first remark. And to do that, I think they need to think about more operational improvements, technical improvements, before moving to the new fuels, where, of course, we have some leaders, it could be North Europe or, wherever it is. So that would be my answer here. Probably back to more practical solutions, having now in mind, this time frame. And there are good solutions. We had some panels, as you said earlier this week, and I think there are a lot of solutions were raised, mentioned, and shared by many players, located in Greece.
Those Greek players, of course, have been busy this week negotiating a pretty significant addition to the order book. But it looks like the conventionally fueled designs are now dominating the negotiations after a period of dual-fueled optionality. So, are we seeing a retrenchment in the strategy here? Are they assuming that the green fuel supply is now so unlikely and the eco-ship designs are so eco-friendly that they can get through 2040 without any dual-fuel premiums? It's just not worth it.
It's definitely part of the thoughts shared by many players, maritime players, about the availability, the scalability, and the cost of these new fuels. And honestly, these new fuels will make sense as long as they are green, and today they are not, or to a certain extent. And this is why, by the way, we have seen a regain of the LNG as a fuel over the past months in different sectors. Including in the container ship segments, moving from methanol to LNG option. So yes, that's definitely something which is changing. For how long, difficult to know, but at least until the new fuels are ready, there will be time. There will be time, yes, for sure.
The fact that these conversations were happening in Posidonia, not North Shipping, is notable. The bulker and tanker companies are arguably less able to move ahead than those in the liner trades, where predictability is key, although I suspect that some in the liner sector might question that. Either way, the headline message from a high-profile succession of ship owners this week in Athens was that scaled ordering of zero-carbon fuel ships is not on the immediate horizon for them. But we should be careful interpreting that too far beyond ship owners talking bluntly to a home crowd of, well, let's call them pragmatists for now.
Yeah, no, I think we've always known that not everybody is going to decarbonize at the same pace, right? I think we're in a part of the industry where I think there's clearly a sense that they shouldn't be the leaders, right? And I think we've talked about that. And then if you're a smaller owner, I think that there is some merit to that. But I do think it's up to people like us to continue pushing the agenda. I do think what is encouraging to me is, although the sentiment is not great, I agree with you around decarbonization here this week, the reality is the IMO is continuing to make steps forward. So I think in the end of the day, we will be sitting here in a year probably with a much clearer pathway on regulation, and that also means that this part of the industry will have to continue to do its work. But it is true that at the moment it feels like people are putting a little bit the head in the sand and hoping that it somehow goes away again.
That was, of course, Jan Dieleman, Head of Ocean Transportation for Cargill. And I asked him for his views because he was name-checked quite a few times this week by some of the notable pragmatists in the crowd, who levelled the accusation that it was, in fact, big charterers like Cargill not being willing to pay a green premium that was to blame for lack of progress. Obviously, I asked him.
Well, I think you have to separate a little bit the things, right? In the end of the day, we're all having to face the market, right? And the market is the market, and it's easy to say for people that if they don't like the number, it's because someone doesn't want to pay the green premium. So I always a bit skeptical around that, and I've seen that many times before in my career. I do think in the end of the day, if you look what we've been deploying and what we've been doing, I don't think you can say that we're not pulling our weight. In the end of the day, I think actually at times we are somehow stepping into the role that the owner actually should be doing, but because they're not doing it, we're actually doing it. So I think that market forces, and especially in dry, I think the market is a bit disappointing for a lot of people. There are probably some frustrations, and then people tend to somehow point the finger at somebody else as the reason for that. So I think it's just a fact of life. I think we just continue to try to keep on moving forward, but the reality is, and I think there is some truth in some of this, is getting the green premium paid is hard in this industry, and we just need to get creative.
I'm going to close where I started with Knut from DNV, who, as I said at the outset, I would class as a progressive, but now a pragmatic progressive. It's not that things aren't moving, but things are changing.
Well, I think, the industry has moved quite fast over the recent years, and you see that in the uptake of dual fuel capabilities. Now, I believe about 50% of the vessels on order are dual fuel capable, which is, a significant step. Looking at the fleet in totality, there is still 93% running on conventional fuel. So, but obviously, as we move forward and we are gradually adapting more flexibility on the fuel consumption side, the industry is prepared. But I would say that the real challenge is now on the supply side, and not least because also energy security is moving way up on the priority list. And also we've seen a rise in costs for the renewable developments. The world has changed as well. So a lot has happened in 2 years. And not least on the geopolitical side, and not least with the change in the supplies around the world and energy security, as we mentioned. But I think that, we promoted very early that the shipping industry need to look beyond its own industry to create partnerships, to help create the infrastructure and the supply side. And this has proven to be much more challenging, and some of the big players can probably secure the green fuels. But if you look to, for instance, the tramp ship owners, there's just no way that they will be able to secure it. And realizing that 2050 is a very hairy, audacious goal.
That's where I'm going to end it this week. This was just a snapshot of the conversations that we were having out in Posidonia this week, and I hope to bring you some more detail on some different topics later. But thank you to everybody who took time to talk to me this week, and to those of you staggering your way through the airport listening to this, safe travels home. To the rest of you, thank you for listening. We will be back next week. Have a good week. Bye.